transcription adds true value. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to make that argument. I'm going to show the value it adds, and I'm going to show some different options and some, again, feasible ways that we can work this into our practice. So, you know, this is a reminder, something we all know, the old Bloom and Leahy form, content, and use. When we think about language, we often think about form, content, and use, the grammar, the vocabulary, the pragmatics. When we're thinking about language use and pragmatics within discourse, what we're usually thinking about is discourse organization skills. How well can you stay on topic? How well can you tell a well-organized story? Can you provide a well-formed argument? And all of those rubrics that I shared for you, or shared with you, they all do a good job of that. They are all looking mainly at those discourse level skills. In particular, one that's been looked at a lot are narrative organization skills, right? So you've probably heard the term story grammar, and that's basically what those rubrics are doing, is telling you what's the student's story grammar like? How are they doing at presenting a setting, at describing a problem, at attempts to resolve that problem and coming up with a resolution. We can look at other discourse level measures. We can look at how well you're staying on topic. We can look, for example, with persuasion. You know, are you anticipating counter arguments and responding to those counter arguments? Another thing that's been looked at is what impact are you having on the listener? So there's lots of great discourse level measures. One term that we use to describe these is macro structure, right? So these are those overall discourse measures. The reason we call them macro is because it's kind of broad. You kind of go back, look at the broad macro skills. These are concepts that you can't just communicate in a single utterance. These are concepts that transcend the individual utterance and go across a piece of discourse, right? So in the first part of my presentation, hopefully the macro structure of that presentation was describing how you can incorporate rubrics into your clinical practice. When someone's telling a story, we look at the broad thing, the broad aspect of the story of how well did they develop the plot. And that's primarily what our rubrics do. Another important feature within discourse is microstructure. These are things that happen within the individual utterance. These are basically the form and the content, the grammar and the syntax, right? So I can tell you about rubrics and how you use them in your clinical practice, and I need to have that be well organized, but the only way I can do that is by using the appropriate vocabulary, by using sentence structure. I'm providing some pretty technical descriptions, so I'm probably doing a lot of subordination and use of complex syntax to get these points across. These are important features of discourse that we often miss with those rubrics, and where you really need that transcription is to look at that microstructure, right? So what are things that we need to look at? How well can you assemble sentences? How well are you incorporating tense and morphology? How well are you embedding clauses, right? So these are things that a lot of our norm reference tests do, but what our language samples are doing are showing how are you using these skills in a real, meaningful communication task. So what are some examples of form? You know, things like inflectional morphemes we played at the park, things like embedded clauses, the girl, which girl? Oh, the girl who was wearing a hat, played at the park. We can look at multiple embedded clauses. Those are the types of things that we can only really get when we get to transcription. We can also look at content, at the vocabulary, at the meaning that's being expressed. So are you using accurate and precise words? Really, are you able to access these words as you are conversing with someone, as you are engaged in discourse? Right, so we can look and see, all right, you know, can you point to the right word, like on the Peabody, or can you describe semantic relations? But what we're really looking at here is, when the rubber hits the road, are you able to draw on that vocabulary in order to have a meaningful conversation, produce a well-formed narrative? Are you using that appropriate vocabulary? So we can look at things, things that we can often look at with our language samples, things like elaborated noun phrases. So if you're describing a puppy, like a puppy in a story, we often want to provide a rich description. So which puppy was it? It was the frightened little puppy, right? That's a much more rich description than just the puppy. We often will look for mental state words. So especially within narratives, we often want to know characters' thoughts and emotions and motivations. We can look at the use of adverbs and are they using the appropriate technical terminology? Again, these are things, you see them sprinkled into some of the rubrics, but really to get a full understanding of the use of vocabulary, you're going to have to work at the transcript level, work with a transcribed sample. So why else? You haven't convinced me yet, John. Why transcripts? Let me try to provide some more convincing for you. Like I just said, we can examine a much wider range of skills. We can go beyond just the pragmatics or the macro structure, and we can really look at that form and that content. So for example, we can look at something like good old MLU, mean length of utterance. And I'm going to show some examples of how utterances get longer, and this can be an indication of overall language ability. It also can be an indication of your effectiveness as a communicator, right? So, teacher mad, very simple two-word utterance. We could kind of have a picture in our mind of who that student might be. My teacher mad at them. So this is a little bit better. We're getting more in there. We're getting some different elements of the sentences. If this is a mainstream American English speaker, there may be some grammatical features that we may expect to be in there, and that could be informative to us. My teacher was mad when the boys yelled. Oh, now we have a nice full sentence. We have some complex syntax. We have some subordination. We have a clause that's modifying a temporal concept, the time concept. When was your teacher mad? Well, she was mad specifically when the boys yelled. And then, if we're working with our older students, we might expect to have, multiple embedded clauses, right? So this would be a very common sentence that we see in our typically developing students who are engaged in persuasion, trying to persuade to have a later start day. So we can really get a rich description of that form and that syntax when we're looking at something like mean length of utterance. So mean length of utterance, it has been described and studied as an overall index of language ability. In particular, it captures grammar and syntax and is fairly sensitive to growth, especially in younger students. Lexical diversity. This is also something that's hard to capture without transcription. On the left here, I have some examples you can read through. Very simple vocabulary, kind of repeating a lot of words, not drawing on a rich, diverse set of words in order to communicate. You can see, on the other hand, where these aren't necessarily longer sentences, but they're much more sophisticated sentences. They are much more descriptive. They're much more accurate sentences. So, and we would expect that to come from a more skilled communicator. Communicators who is either younger or having some difficulties or disorders. We might expect to see the more simple vocabulary on the left. Someone who has a more sophisticated vocabulary, doesn't have a disorder, or maybe has a disorder but is at a later developmental stage. We would expect them to be able to draw on these more precise, higher level, lower frequency vocabulary words. So when we do our transcription, when we transcribe our language samples, we can look at things like number of different words or ways of looking at type token ratio. We can look for just getting a qualitative judgment of the richness of their lexicon. Are they pulling in some of these rich words? Are they able to use this diverse lexicon effectively when they're communicating and using their vocabulary? Is this having an impact on the people that they're communicating with? Again, really the only way we can get a full impression of this is by doing some sort of analysis with a transcript. So reason number one for why transcripts is we can look at those different features. Reason number two, in my personal experience training students and doing my own transcription, I believe that transcription enhances the accuracy. If I'm trying to evaluate the overall quality of a story, if I've taken the time to transcribe it or read a transcript, I'm getting a more accurate picture. Just the process in and of itself can give rich insight. So before, the picture I had there of Tom, he had someone available to transcribe for him. He preferred to transcribe himself because just that process of transcription, he felt, gave him a lot of insight into the strengths and difficulties that the student was having. Reason number three is that the transcript, it's a nice way of getting a written record of the student's performance. Here I just have a random SALT transcript. This is one that comes free with the SALT program. And you can see, you can't really read this, I know, but you can see that we get a written record of what their language looked like at this particular point in time. It's really nice for us to be able to go back and refer to it. It's nice for us to be able to share this with others. And speaking of sharing with others, I've been part of IEP meetings. I've talked to a lot of SLPs who use language sampling in IEP meetings, in meetings with students, in meetings with parents, in meetings with teachers. And the transcript is often a central part of that meeting. It can often give very rich insight into the strengths and difficulties that a student's having. If it's, if you're just kind of having difficulty putting your finger on, the types of things that are difficult for him or her, they often will show themselves in the language sample, which then you have a written record to share. Also, like I said, having that record of their performance at that point in time helps to give a reference over time, right? The inability to repeat sentences in kindergarten on the self-P as compared to some subtest on the told in third grade isn't real informative or meaningful, especially for non-specialists. Looking at telling a story in 4-year-old kindergarten versus second grade, and we're trying to make discharge decisions, this can either say, can tell us this has been a consistent issue that the student needs to continue to work on, or the student has made tremendous growth. Look how much they've grown. We need to work on a new skill, consider discharge, further enhance this skill. Again, this is multiple reports that I've gotten from regular language sample users that these are some of the more powerful tools they have for engaging with the other stakeholders involved in their students. So I'm next going to talk about some different transcription options, okay? That's always going to be a question, and I want to provide all the options that are out there. One option is what I call simple transcription, no frills transcription. Transcription without any specialized software. This can be a notepad, this can be a yellow legal pad, this can be Google Docs, this can be Microsoft Word, this can be, whatever else. But that is a very viable way of completing language sample analysis, is transcribing it, not using specialized software. There is a group, Bob Owens and Stacy Pavelko. They developed this system that they call Sugar, and it's not specialized software. It's basically just giving you some guidance on how to do a language sample within Microsoft Word or Google Docs, giving you some tips and tricks on how to calculate MLU. So basically, numbering the lines that are on the Word document and generating the number of total words, and then you can calculate MLU without having to count each individual word. So with this simple transcription, you get that written record, and you're able to calculate simple measures. Basically, what you can calculate reasonably is MLU, mean length of utterance. You can get your subjective impressions. You can share this information with others. So you might be saying, hey, John, what I heard you say is I can just write down a few utterances while my student is talking. Isn't that what you said? That's not what I said, all right? Couple things with this statement. One is that real-time transcription just is not that accurate, especially with our students with disorders. There's intelligibility issues. It's really difficult. The other thing is when we're collecting our language samples, we generally want to be good communication partners. So, trying to write down everything a student says while they're telling you about what they did over the weekend or telling you a story, it's not being a very good communication partner. The other part of that is kind of a trick question, is that just talking is not a standardized protocol, right? So again, getting back to that first part, what I'd like you to start thinking about is what type of language sample am I collecting? How am I collecting this? What information am I getting? What's the relationship with the curriculum and the educational impact, right? So I think simple transcription, not using specialized software, it is a perfectly valid and good way of collecting a language sample. I would try to follow some sort of standardized protocol. I would try to follow some sort of standardized way of transcribing it. The information that Pavelko and Owens provide in their Sugar website, it provides as good as any. You could follow the SALT rules without using SALT. It's all basically the same. So getting back to our buddy Will, what value would you get from this extra effort of that basic transcription? So let's just take a look at this, and let's say that we may have heard Will say this. They play soccer. That's her house. They are in front. She raised her hand. This is very common. This is very common for young children when they're narrating. This is very common for children with language disorders when they're narrating. What we're seeing here is very surface level commentary, right? We're seeing that, there's some sentences that are constructed fairly well. We're seeing that, yes, it's related to the content, but what we're seeing is they're missing the plot. They're missing the story. They're missing the point. What's the point here? The point is setting the background. They're friends. They're playing soccer. They like to play together. We're starting to introduce a problem. You can see from the sun. We see the sweat of the possum. We saw in the script that there's a problem the problem in the story is that it's hot and they need a drink. Will, in this case, is missing that point. So by having the rubric, we would capture that he's missing that point. We already saw that value added. The transcript, it could help confirm your suspicions. When you read through it, you're like, oh my gosh, he's not really telling a story. He's just describing the pictures. We could document that strikingly low MLU, right? We would expect other kids his age to be telling longer, fully formed sentences with some level of embedding. We share this transcript with mom, and mom's like, oh my gosh, that's him. That's him exactly. He tells a story, but he doesn't tell the story, right? All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about specialized software. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about SALT and the other specialized software and show the value that they add. The thing with these specialized software programs is they go beyond MLU with no effort, right? So if you want to look at something like type token ratio or a number of different words, it's really hard to do on Microsoft Word. You'd have to do it by hand. The specialized software, it's going to do it for you automatically. So getting back to the specialized software, I'm going to talk about two main pieces of specialized software. One is SALT. One is called the CLAN program, Computerized Language Analysis. It's part of the Childist website. I have links for both of these tools available. The nice thing about this specialized software is it goes beyond MLU. We can get number of different words, type token ratio calculated immediately. We can also look at other discourse features. Some kids, some individuals, some students with language disorders have relatively fluent speech. Some speak a lot, some don't speak much. A good number of kids have difficulty formulating their ideas. They do what we call reduplication and reformulation. You know these as mazes, right? So the specialized software, it's able to calculate these for you automatically. They're going to be very hard to calculate if you don't have the specialized software. You can look at things like pauses and how many words per minute are they producing? What's their verbal fluency? Get a detailed description of errors and omissions and what types of errors, what types of omissions, where are we seeing these? We can also get more detailed information on the type of complex syntax that they're using. So the power of the computer, the power of the software is that you can go beyond MLU. With hand transcription, you basically just get mean length of utterance. With the specialized software, you can get all of these different discourse features. With these discourse features, you can get more rich description of profiles of strengths and weaknesses. This is an old Typologies document that was developed by the SALT group in Madison. These typologies were developed by Madison speech language pathologists in Madison Metro School District. And showing how these different measures can go together to develop these different profiles. Some students with language disorders have difficulty formulating their utterances and finding the words. Some students talk a lot. Some students don't talk so much. Some students have pretty good syntax and grammar, but their real difficulty is in the pragmatics and the discourse organization. By getting all of these different measures, we're able to see these profiles of strengths and weaknesses. So I just want to do a quick comparison for you so you understand these different software options. So the first one is hand transcription. And no matter what you're using, you're going to have to elicit the sample and record it. You're going to have to transcribe it. You're going to have to probably do some level of hand coding, code it for narrative organization skills. These two programs, so the Childess or the CLAN program and the SALT program, they will generate those measures for you automatically, and you can look at many different measures. The other thing when you're considering the difference between Childess and CLAN and SALT, one thing to realize and consider is that CLAN, the software CLAN that goes with Childess, is free. It's freely available. You can download it. It was developed and primarily used by researchers. There are a lot of papers that you can find describing the use of it within clinical practice, but that's where it came from, is from the use of research. SALT was originally developed primarily to answer research questions, but especially through the 80s and 90s and into today, the primary goal of SALT is to develop a tool that can be used by clinicians. So there's a few things that they have done to help meet that goal. One is that you are able to do an automatic comparison to databases, and I'll show you what that looks like in a bit. But if you get that transcript, you can get all those measures and you can have a comparison group and see how does your student compare to that database. It also, this is a relatively new feature, has a clinical summary that's available. So it'll put the results into a written summary of the testing that you can copy and paste and modify. And if you've used the two programs, I think most people would agree that SALT is more developed for Windows, Mac operating systems and operators who are used to point and click, versus CLAN has more of a feel of being like an old school basic programming. You still use a mouse and things, but it's not quite as sharp and refined and polished. There is a free fee involved. SALT costs money. Childess or CLAN is free. If you have questions about that, I had a slide that compared overall cost and showed, when you consider everything, that it's relatively even. The fee, when you compare it to some of the other things we have to pay for, is relatively small. If you need help convincing your school district that SALT is a purchase that should be made. There's a strong argument that could be made about that. Anyone from SALT can help you make that. I can help you make that. It's beyond what I want to discuss today, but it's there. And again, my disclosure, I like SALT. I use it in my own research. I've used it in my clinical practice, but I have no issue with hand transcription, Childis and Clan. They can be powerful tools as well. You have to use whatever is right for you. So I want to talk a little bit about comparing the databases. So once we collect these language samples, and if you do this transcript, one thing you might be faced with is, okay, is MLU is 5.5. What does that mean again? So we need to have some sort of comparison that we can make. And there's all types of charts that are available. I have a link to a bunch of different charts. I have one of our papers here describing our expository database. And we have benchmark data for each grade on all of the different measures that are available. And I have links for, you can refer back to good old Brown's morphemes. Those are still pretty good. You can refer to other papers written by us, written by other groups that provide this benchmark data. One of the nice things, again, with SALT that I think makes it a powerful tool is that it automates the process, right? The screenshot is a little fuzzy here, but you can see this is that sample child that they have, and it shows, what did the child score on each of these different language features? What did a comparison database score? And what are the areas where I see either a relative strength or weakness, and it stars those automatically for you. And this is an example of that report that's generated automatically, okay? The other software doesn't do this. Because this is developed as a clinical tool, it helps provide these tools and resources that are very clinician oriented. What's the value added to Will, right? So we go beyond MLU with no extra effort. My opinion, my issue with the Microsoft Word transcribing by hand, if you just take that little bit more effort of getting it into Clan or SALT, instead of just getting MLU, you get every measure that's available, right? And they're all calculated for you automatically. MLU is great. I think, the real power of language sampling is showing profiles of strength and weakness. You get that with the specialized software. So you get that more precise data to share. So I have some resources in thinking about the next steps. My first point here, we're getting towards the end, so I'm going to get my closing arguments here for you. My first point that I really need you to think about is, in order to make language sample analysis happen, you have to believe that language sampling is important, right? So I can sit here and I can tell you all the reasons why I think that language sampling is important, but unless you believe it's important, it's not going to happen. You need to believe it's important in order to go download those rubrics and learn those protocols, right? And I hope that I've made the case. I hope that you see the importance. I hope you see the value of the rule change, right? I know that any change is difficult, and there may be some things that are difficult to work through, but the reason why some of those changes were in there, like putting language sample analysis into the rule change, into the rule, is because of the belief that these assessments are important. They provide important, meaningful data. The other part of this is that any type of change that you make is going to be impacted by the broader system that you're in, right? So if now you're coming in with these language samples to IEP meetings and people haven't seen them before, don't understand them, you're the one who has to have that understanding and that belief that this is important data. You have to be the one to explain how these data are documenting that educational impact, how these data are providing that insight. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about how some districts have had success getting centralized transcription. And there's been a lot of districts that have had success getting support to get someone to help transcribe these samples for you. The downfall that has also happened in those districts is that people stopped using those services and they got rid of those services. Why do people stop using those services? Because they don't believe that these language samples are providing meaningful information. We have to believe that they are. And my belief is the more language sampling we can do, the better ability we will have to show that educational impact and to work on these meaningful individualized education programs. My other suggestion, build off your competencies. Get rid of that PTSD of grad school of C units and T units and modals and things like that. You can do it, but let's not start there. Let's start by building on your competencies. We all love administering standardized tests. I've given you a lot of standardized protocols that you can use. You know your students. You know the types of difficulties they're having. So find a context that's going to help you see profiles of strengths and weaknesses. You also know what's important for your students, right? You know what's in the curriculum, or you can know what's in the curriculum. You need to know what's in the curriculum. And how can we use these language samples to identify where they're falling behind in that curriculum, where they're falling behind in their day-to-day lives, and where we can help them out. So I recommend, if you haven't done any language sampling or haven't done it since grad school, start with those rubrics. Learn the protocols, record your samples, practice the coding, and just go for it, right? I encountered this a lot where I need to do a new type of methodology or a new technique in my class, and I sometimes psych myself out by reading about it a lot and feel like I have to be an expert and know everything before I do it. In my experience, get up to speed enough to feel a level of comfort and just going for it. Trying this on your students is the best way to learn and see how useful these tools can be. Once you've started collecting samples, I really hope that you think about moving on to transcription. There are so many resources available online. If you want to learn SALT, there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens training videos, modules you can take. The hand transcription, the Sugar site, they have a lot of resources on how you can do transcription. There are all the resources you need out there. You do need some time. You need some practice. If you do transcription, it's a skill that you need to maintain that competency, but it can add a very meaningful piece to your practice. Now, the question I always get in these types of things, what about text to speech? Siri is amazing, and Siri is amazing. Zoom meetings and the automatic transcription in Zoom is amazing, and it is amazing. However, these usually are highly contextualized, highly clear speaking situations. There's a group that I know that does professional transcription, and they would love to find the most efficient way to transcribe samples. And they've done cost-benefit analyses of text-to-speech versus just transcription. And despite all the technology, transcription still wins. There's a recent paper came out saying, you can get a full transcript with text-to-speech and then go back and clean it up, so that could be an option. Another thing that some people have done is listen to a sample with earbuds in and done text-to-speech to transcribe. If that works for you, that's great. There's different strategies out there. I will say that despite the technology and how amazing it is, in my experience, it's just not quite there for the type of analysis and type of transcription we need. So are there shortcuts? I alluded to the free lunch earlier. Unfortunately, in my experience, there is no free lunch, right? There's no specific technology that we can get to do transcription. But I encourage you to think about free lunch versus maybe PTO provided lunch, and what kind of resources can you acquire? What kind of resources can you leverage to try to get some support? And there have been success stories. There have been success stories. There have been many districts who have gotten transcription services either in-house or outsourced. In-house transcription, it could be a special ed aide. Part of their time is for transcription. It could be an administrative assistant and getting part of their workload. There's been success stories of that. Often districts don't love that because usually there's salary and benefits tied to something. Oftentimes, actually, districts will prefer just outsourcing it. So for example, SALT Software offers transcription services. I don't get paid by them. They actually just break even. They don't really make money on transcription services. But that service is there available to help promote clinicians get it. And there may be other transcription services that I'm not aware of. Districts have had success with creative funding. They've had success going to their administrators and saying, hey, we're bringing in tons of Medicaid funding that is not going anywhere. I think this should be used for speech language services. Now, I'm not saying that's going to necessarily work for you. I will say it won't work for you if you don't believe in it. So getting back to my point, if you can make the case, if you can believe in this, I'm not guaranteeing that your administrators will provide centralized transcription. I can guarantee they're not just going to go out and get you centralized transcription and hand it to you unless you truly believe and you truly advocate for it. That's all I'm going to say about that. If you have questions about how you might go about this, you can contact me. I can put you in touch with other districts that have had success, tell you the other strategies that I've heard of that have worked. Will was a pretty straightforward case. I'll give the example of Maria. Maria could be in kindergarten and have a suspected language disorder, just like Will. She got a standard score of the self-P of 77. But in this particular case, we may be questioning the validity of these data, given Maria's bilingual status and the fact that the self-P isn't normed or developed for bilingual speakers. So one strategy you could use is working with the ESL teacher on something like the narrative assessment protocol, right? And then, a type of profile you might see is that when you collected that narrative in English, she was having a lot of difficulties. But when the ESL teacher worked with her and collected these data in Spanish, we see a big discrepancy. We see that she did much better. And perhaps we also show, so that these data show that the English data, they show some language difficulties. Spanish performance is notably better. And in this scenario, we could say that, that relatively strong and relatively intact Spanish skills are consistent with what we're getting from a report of the parents and the ESL teacher. So just a scenario of how these data have been described in the literature, how firsthand accounts of using these data have gone. I like the example of Lee because when we're working with those adolescents, those 15-year-olds, who've been in speech and language for a long, long time, if we administer the self, we know what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen, right? Language disorders are a lifelong condition. So how informative is that readministration of the self with a student who's 15 and has a pretty significant communication disorder, language disorder, whatever we want to call it? Also, now that we're getting into high school and adolescence, we're really having a lot of discussions about vocation. So we might be interested in doing something like the persuasion task and seeing how is he doing with this persuasion. And maybe we observe that he doesn't really give any, maybe Lee thinks that, that he should get a raise at work, and he provides one weak reason and doesn't really understand this concept of counter arguments or compromises. So that would be a way of documenting this very functional, very real life impact that this communication disorder is having. And for my money, from my perspective, would be a great, meaningful, functional task to work on within that individualized education program, within the therapy that you're providing. If we add the transcription, we may also observe that he has a relative strength in verbal fluency, low overall language, which is consistent with what we saw, but maybe he's really having a lot of reduplications and reformulations, a lot of those mazes, just not able to get that point out. And this is a direct quote from a student who did a language sample and talking to his SLP. When he read the transcript, he said, yeah, I kind of screwed that up. So giving that insight, giving the understanding of the disorder for the student themselves and the other stakeholders at the table.
So thank you. Thank you for your time today and sharing. I know it was hard, like this is like your life's work and we asked you in 90 minutes. How can we apply this to working with kids in schools?
Yeah. Well, it's an important question. It's a question that I hope to tackle for many, many years to come. I would love any feedback. If you have questions for me, you can always email me. I'm easy to find. If you want me to share any of my resources, I'm happy to share them. And that goes for anyone in this or watching it online or in general.